whenever I do these reaction videos, I try to have a sort of story arc. I want to say, here's the difficult data to interpret, here's how a psychologist would look at it, and as a result, here's the conclusions that I would draw. And as it relates to the Casey Anthony documentary, to Caylee Anthony's death, I can't do that. There are so many things, so many pieces of this puzzle that make no sense to me. I don't know where to start. So what I want to do is I wanted to sort of walk through the case or my thinking and just point out all the things that just don't connect. The first thing is, we have to figure out, did Caylee die as a result of a common accident or was she killed? In my mind, it's very unlikely that it was a typical accident. The defense said that Caylee fell into the family swimming pool and drowned. That would sort of assume then that there was nothing distorted happening with the family. It would assume then that the family would react in a typical way. They would try and save the daughter, they would call 911, they'd be frantic, they'd be wanting help, they'd be screaming, they'd be terrified. There would be no sense of guilt, no reason to lie. That's not how they reacted. They reacted in a very distorted way. So I assume something distorted happened. The question is, was it Casey or was it George? Neither one in my mind have the motive. There's no motivator for either of them. Yes, Casey wanted to be free. Yes, it was burdensome to be a mother of a toddler. But there are a lot of people that feel burdened by raising toddlers. There are a lot of people that want to go out and party. That on its own doesn't feel like enough to hang a murder trial on. And as it relates to George, there's no motivation for him to kill his granddaughter unless he accidentally killed her and then covered it up. The next piece of this, which makes no sense, is the fact that Caylee's body was missing for 30 plus days before the police were contacted. In my mind, if I killed somebody, I would want to act like I wasn't a killer. So first of all, I would hide the body further away from my house, more than a quarter mile. I would do something to try and destroy the body, which they didn't. I would make an effort to cooperate with the cops as much as possible. I would notify them quickly, and I would say, my daughter's missing, help me, I'm a grieved parent. I would answer all of their questions. I'd be truthful about where I worked and where I was last. I'd have a story. I'd have a clear story picked out. And Casey did none of those things. And so it's like a grieved parent would have handled it better. A murderer would have handled it better. To me, it just reeks of, her reaction reeks of psychological dysfunction. But my interpretation of that doesn't fit Casey's performance on the MMPI. Apparently, she scored very well on the assessment and didn't flag for any kind of psychological dysfunction. This is a very robust assessment. It's called the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, and it is designed to identify clinically significant issues in people's psychological functioning. Now, you can't give someone the MMPI and walk away and go, oh, for sure you have this diagnosis. But it certainly measures a wide range of psychological constructs that are very relevant to mental disorders like antisocial personality disorder or narcissism. I mean, there are specific scales that measure things like aggressiveness, antisocial behavior, psychoticism. Like, those are specific scales in this assessment. And the idea that this woman, who we know is an out-and-out liar, lied to the police, she hid from the police, the idea that an assessment that is measuring antisocial behavior doesn't elevate on that scale is crazy to me. But I do think it's important to think about Casey's decision to lie to the police. From a self-preservation standpoint, that doesn't serve her. My best guess is that it's sort of a combination of her being a narcissist and having antisocial personality disorder. Right? People that are antisocial are comfortable deceiving others. They're comfortable hurting others. They don't feel any remorse. And people that are narcissistic can be so exceptionally arrogant that they have this delusion that they are better than everybody else, that they can get away with things more than other people. And so I think it's a combination of her thinking, I can trick the police because I'm special, and a combination of, I don't really care about the police or my daughter or what's happening right now. And to me, that together led to that super odd behavior. Another piece of this that makes no sense is the fact that Casey's defense team is now her family. She works for one of the attorneys. She goes to their houses for holidays. They're hugging and crying together. They're so close and connected. And it's like, I think the average person looks at it and goes, how could you know who this person is? How could you see all of the evidence against her and then trust her so much that you bring her into your home? And I think the answer is cognitive dissonance. This is a theory that says essentially that it is psychologically distressing to believe one thing and behave another way. If you are defending this person who could be a murderer, I think you have to convince yourself she's not, she's great, she's trustworthy, she's reliable, so that your behavior of defending her fits how you're actually feeling about her. And so my guess would be that over that 3-year trial or whatever it was, the defense team had to really do a lot psychologically to make their behavior okay. And the last piece of this, which is the hardest part to kind of break down, is the culmination of the documentary with Casey's revelation that her dad must have suffocated Kaylee in an effort to sexually assault her and accidentally killed her and then hid her. That's what the documentary ends with, and this idea that Casey doesn't really put that together until now, whatever it is, 10 years after the end of the trial. And there's so many pieces of that don't quite make sense. So the first is the argument that because my dad sexually assaulted me, I was under a trance when I lost my daughter for those 30 days. And during that 30-day period, I wouldn't work with the police. I was non-cooperative. I wouldn't look for my daughter because I so much believed in my dad, who had for so many years assaulted me. Here's the thing, and they had psychologists on the documentary saying, look, the abuse can show up that way. Here's the reality. Psychology is a soft science. There is no reaction that anybody on the planet could have that a psychologist wouldn't show up and say, could happen. Now, there is typical behavior, and Casey's behavior was absolutely atypical. But no psychologist is ever going to say that something is impossible. So yes, it is possible that if you grew up in a household and you were being repeatedly sexually assaulted by your father, that when you're 20 years old, you have an odd relationship where you can't stand up to him, where you're overly deferential, where you're subservient to him and you do whatever he says. That is a viable reaction. Pretty unlikely that you would go 30 days and not break out of that trance, but it's possible. Now, during the trial, Casey did come forward and say, my dad sexually assaulted me, but she didn't accuse him of hurting Kaylee, which is interesting to me because certainly the defense team would have sat down and said, what are all the ways that this couldn't have been Casey's fault? The fact that they went through this 3-year trial and her dad was never, they weren't checking his phone records, he was never ever a suspect, they didn't do a good job on the trial of pointing to him, again, doesn't fit. So it's like Casey was clearly out of this trance. She was clearly talking about the abuse. Why is this revelation just happening now, 15 years later? It just doesn't. I can't imagine that she was in this trance for 15 years through a trial and not able to think about it. And what's even harder for me to wrap my head around is this idea in the documentary that she says, my dad's so distorted, I don't want to blame him for her death, but he did say that he liked the smell of her sweet sweat, which is gross, by the way. And she goes, I don't know where I heard that. And the person interviewing her says it was from Kaylee's funeral. And Casey starts crying, and she goes, oh my gosh, I never got to see that footage. She watches the footage, and it all comes back to her exactly what happened, pretty crystal clear. And it's like, first of all, I don't believe for a second that you went the last 10 plus years and you never once watched your daughter's funeral. I simply don't believe that. I also don't think that your father's comment when giving a eulogy about how he misses how your daughter smells is necessarily representative of him sexually assaulting her. And I for sure struggle with the idea that you have this ultimate clarity now for this documentary when you didn't have the clarity when you were talking to a therapist, you had a mental health advocate, you had your defense team there, and you didn't put any of that story together. It's just hard for me to believe. So I walk away from this thinking, I don't trust either one of them. My best guess is something did happen. I think both Casey and George are aware of it, and we're never going to know.